There is a pressure you have been carrying for so long that you have stopped being able to feel its edges. It does not come from any single thing. That is what makes it so difficult to talk about. If it came from your job, you could change jobs. If it came from your marriage, you could work on your marriage. If it came from your finances, you could make a plan. But this pressure does not point to anything you can fix. It is simply there, underneath everything. A low and constant sense that you are somehow behind, that you are not doing enough, that something is required of you that you are failing to deliver. You feel it on Sunday afternoons, when there is nothing you have to do, and instead of rest, you feel a vague guilt, as though resting itself were a kind of negligence. You feel it when you finally finish something, and instead of satisfaction, there is only the briefest pause before the pressure resumes, pointing now at the next thing, and the next. You feel it in the morning before you are fully awake. A tightening, a bracing, a sense that the day is already a test you are not prepared for, and you have never given it a name, because it does not seem to have one. It is just the texture of being you, the background condition of your life, so familiar that you have mistaken it for your personality. It is not your personality. It is a pressure, and it has a source. And once you can see the source, you can begin, slowly, to be free of it. The pressure has no name because you have never been introduced to the one applying it. So let me introduce you. There is, inside you, a judge. He has been there so long that you do not experience him as separate from yourself. You experience his verdicts as simply the truth. When he says you should have done more, you do not hear a voice. You simply feel that you should have done more. When he says you are falling behind, you do not hear an accusation. You simply feel behind. He has so completely fused with your sense of self that you cannot tell where he ends and you begin. But he is not you. He is a judge you installed. Slowly, over many years, built from the expectations of your father, the comparisons of your school, the standards of your culture, the metrics of your work, the curated lives on your screen, each one adding a clause to the law he enforces, until the law became so vast and so detailed that no human being could ever satisfy it. And then he took up his position inside you and began his work. And his work is this: he holds you to the law, constantly, without mercy, without rest. He does not acknowledge what you have done. He only points to what remains. He does not permit satisfaction, because satisfaction would mean the case is closed, and the case must never close, because the open case is the only thing that keeps you producing. This is the pressure. It is the pressure of standing trial, every day of your life, before a judge who will never acquit you, because your conviction is the engine of your usefulness, and he has confused your usefulness with your worth. Psychology knows this judge well. It has several names for him: the inner critic, the harsh superego, the internalized parent, the punitive self. Whatever the name, the phenomenon is the same. A part of the psyche that has taken the external standards a person was raised under and turned them inward into a permanent tribunal. And the research on this is sobering, because it turns out that this internal judge does not actually produce what he promises. He promises that his pressure will make you better, more disciplined, more successful. But the studies on self-criticism show almost the opposite. Chronic self-criticism is associated with higher anxiety, higher rates of depression, lower resilience, and paradoxically, lower achievement over time. Because the energy spent defending against the judge is energy not spent on the actual work, the man driven by an inner judge is not more productive. He is more exhausted, and his exhaustion eventually undermines the very performance the judge was demanding. There is a psychiatrist named Curt Thompson who has spent his career studying this through the lens of both neuroscience and faith. And he observes that shame, which is the emotion this judge runs on, does not just make us feel bad. It isolates us. It tells us that if anyone saw what the judge sees, they would reject us. And so we hide, we perform, we present a managed version of ourselves to the world. And the hiding is itself exhausting, because a man who is always hiding is a man who can never rest in the presence of another person. Psychology can map this judge with remarkable precision. It can trace where he came from. It can measure the damage he does. It can even, with good therapy, begin to soften his voice. But psychology runs into a wall at the most important question of all. The judge is demanding a verdict, a final declaration that you are enough, that you have done enough, that you are acceptable. And psychology, for all its insight, cannot deliver that verdict. It can tell you the judge is too harsh. It can tell you to be kinder to yourself, but it cannot pronounce you innocent because it has no authority to do so. Self-compassion is real and it helps, but in the end, it is the defendant trying to acquit himself. And somewhere deep down, the defendant knows he does not have the authority to close his own case. For the verdict, we have to go somewhere psychology cannot reach. The philosopher who understood this judge most deeply was a strange and solitary Dane named Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard wrote a book called The Sickness Unto Death, and in it he described a condition that he believed almost every modern person suffers from without knowing it. He called it despair, but he did not mean sadness. He meant something more structural. He meant the condition of a self that cannot become itself, a self that is trying constantly and exhaustingly to construct a version of itself that would finally be acceptable, and failing, and trying again. Kierkegaard saw that the modern person is engaged in a desperate project of self-justification, trying to ground his own worth in something, in achievement, in being liked, in being right, in being better than others. And Kierkegaard saw that this project is doomed, not because the person is not trying hard enough, but because no self can serve as its own foundation. A self that tries to ground itself in itself is like a man trying to lift himself by his own collar. The effort is real, the exhaustion is real, and the lifting never happens. And here is Kierkegaard's most piercing insight. He said that this despair is so common and so woven into ordinary life that most people never recognize it. They think they are simply busy, simply ambitious, simply driven. They do not realize that underneath the busyness is a self that is desperately trying to justify its own existence and cannot. That is the judge in philosophical language. The judge is the voice of a self trying to ground itself and failing, and turning the failure into pressure, and the pressure into more trying. Kierkegaard could see the disease with a clarity no one before him had achieved. But Kierkegaard also saw something most philosophers do not admit. He saw that philosophy could not cure it. He saw that the self cannot rescue itself from the project of self-justification by trying harder to justify itself. The only way out, Kierkegaard said, was for the self to rest in the power that established it, to stop being its own judge by submitting to a verdict from outside itself. And Kierkegaard, who was as rigorous a thinker as the modern world has produced, concluded that this verdict could only come from one place. At the center of the Christian gospel is a word that has been so worn down by religious use that most people no longer hear what it actually means. The word is justification. It is a legal word, a courtroom word, and that is not an accident, because the human problem the gospel addresses is precisely the problem of the judge, the problem of a man standing trial before a tribunal he cannot satisfy, carrying a pressure that has no name, because he has never understood that he is, in fact, on trial. And the gospel does something that neither psychology nor philosophy can do. It does not tell the man to be kinder to himself. It does not tell him to lower his standards. It does not tell him to silence his inner critic through technique. It delivers a verdict. It says that the case has already been heard, that the judgment has already been rendered, that the verdict for the man who is in Christ is not guilty. Not because he met the standard. He did not. Not because he did enough. He did not. But because the standard was met on his behalf by someone else, and the verdict was transferred to him as a gift. This is the thing the judge inside you cannot survive. The judge runs on the open case. His entire power comes from the trial that never ends. And the gospel walks into the courtroom and declares the trial over. Not because you won, but because the verdict was given to you freely before you produced a single thing, and cannot be revoked by anything you fail to produce after. Imagine what happens to the pressure when the verdict arrives. The judge says, "You have not done enough." And for the first time you can answer him, not with a defense, not by pointing to your achievements, but by saying, "It does not matter. The case is closed. The verdict came from a court higher than yours, and you have no authority to reopen it." This is what the New Testament means when it says, "There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ." It is not a sentimental phrase. It is a legal fact. The condemnation that has been pressing on you, the nameless pressure that has shaped your entire adult life, has been lifted by an authority the inner judge cannot overrule. You do not have to silence the judge. You could never silence him on your own. You simply have to learn slowly, over years, to hear a higher voice, the voice that has already pronounced you accepted, and to let that voice, not the judge, become the ground you stand on. The pressure has no name, because you thought it was coming from your life. It was coming from the courtroom, and the court has already ruled in your favor. So what do you do with this? Starting today, the judge speaks in a particular voice, and the first step toward freedom is simply learning to recognize it. So here is the practice for this week. Each time you feel the pressure rise, the vague guilt on a quiet afternoon, the bracing before a task, the dissatisfaction after an accomplishment, I want you to do one thing. Name it, say to yourself, silently, "That is the judge." Not, "I am behind," not, "I should be doing more," but that is the judge speaking, and the judge does not have the authority he claims. This small act, naming the voice as separate from yourself, begins to do something the judge cannot tolerate. It creates distance. It reminds you that the pressure is not the truth about you. It is the verdict of a court that has already been overruled. You will not silence him this week. He has been speaking for 30 years, and he will not stop in 7 days. But each time you name him, you weaken the fusion. Each time you remember that a higher verdict has already been given, you loosen his grip by a fraction. And over months of this, naming the judge, remembering the verdict, standing slowly on different ground, the nameless pressure begins, at last, to have a name. And a name is the beginning of freedom. Because what you can name, you can begin to release. You are not going to wake up tomorrow without the pressure. The judge will be in his seat when you open your eyes. But you no longer have to mistake him for yourself. And you no longer have to accept his verdict as final. A higher court has already ruled. The case that has been exhausting you for as long as you can remember is closed.